Hello, it's Matt McLachlan from Living History here. Before we get started on this week's podcast, some really exciting news for all our UK listeners. Now that the borders between France and Britain have opened up, we've launched a range of tours. We've launched Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours in the UK. So now, if you're in the UK, you can travel to France. You can tour those battlefields of the Western Front where men fought and died during the Great War. So we've got great tours. We've got weekends that explore all the battlefields, a special tour for Remembrance Day. There's a whole range of great group and private tours there available now for you to travel on. So they're all escorted by Pete Smith, who you would know from our Battle Walks podcast. He's an absolute expert. He lives on the battlefields of the Somme, and he knows this better than anyone else. He's the perfect person to travel the battlefields with. They're going to be a great range of tours. I'm really excited. So jump on our website, check them out, book them now. It's battlewalks.co.uk, and you can book those tours today.
A Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart.
And I'm Gary Bain.
And together we're Pete and Gary's Military History
Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Peter Hart and I'm with Gary Bain, and we've got a bit of a miserable podcast today. One that casts you it's not as cheerful as we'd want, but it's part of the story of the Royal Norfolk, Second Royal Norfolks, and it has to be dealt with. And we're doing the story of the massacre at Paradis in 1940. So I'm
rather
afraid,
unfortunate name, isn't it? Really?
Yeah. So where are we? Well, they'd already been through a lot, hadn't they? By the time they got to Paradis in late May 1940. What are the? We've done it in the podcast. Just summarise it briefly for us, Gary.
Well, during the Phony War, everything had been calm as they were on the Franco.
All quiet on the Western
Front.
Front?
They were on the Franco-Belgian border with the 4th Brigade.
What's that?
That was the 2nd Norfolks, the 1st 8th Lancashire Fusiliers, and the 1st Royal Scots of the 2nd Division.
So that's right. Yep.
Then the Germans, being the Germans, they launched a massive offensive on the 10th of May, which triggered the real fighting.
Yeah, and it's pretty bad. Then they moved forward into Belgium to the River Dial line. But that's not held, and we've dealt with all this. They retreat. Roads packed with refugees, Stukas diving down, and then they take up positions on the Escaut Canal, which I don't think either of us know how to pronounce, where they fought a big rearguard action that we went through on the 21st of May. The only thing that stinks in my mind is that officer having a bit of a hunt.
Yes. Yeah.
That's typical. What do you remember about the action of the 21st? I remember Peter Barclay hunting, but there you go. They then are ordered back further, and they take up defensive positions along the La Bassée Canal, facing the swirling German panzers that are swirling around. Now, we're great war historians, if we're anything, a sort of historian. What's unusual about the positions they take up?
Well, in this case, the Norfolks are actually facing to the west, which is the reverse of the positions taken up by the BEF, facing the Albers Ridge during the Great War.
So their fathers were pointing in the other direction.
Yeah, almost back to back, one could say.
You're right. Now, the 2nd Division is ordered to screen the retreat of the BEF. So the BEF are falling back on Dunkirk. So this is an important job the 2nd Division's given. And 6th Brigade were responsible for the St. Venin-Ropec sector, and the Norfolks and the rest of 4th Brigade, these are our heroes, are in the centre. They hold the canal from beyond Batoon, while the 5th Brigade, they're in the centre of the 2nd Division part, and the 5th Brigade extend the lines to La Bassée. That may not make any sense whatsoever, but we'll put maps up and things. They're buying time, so this is exchanging lives for time.
Yeah, and this is so the BF can escape back to Dunkirk, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, what state were the Norfolks in when they got to Paradis?
Well, there's total confusion, exhaustion. This is a fighting retreat, and it's beginning to take a toll on them.
So
Pete.
tired?
They're very tired. There's disorganisation. Some of the units are mixed up. Companies had suffered casualties and were becoming less organised. And it's just, typical. a retreat under that sort of
Now,
pressure.
one of the things that happens is there's a gap develops on the canal line between A and C Company, and on 25th of May 1940, the Pioneer section is ordered to fill that gap. Now, that's not the job of Pioneers. It's clearly they're just being put into a gap. And you're going to be Private Ernie Farrow of Pioneer Platoon, Headquarter Company, 2nd Norfolks.
We were to go up onto the top of this canal bank and make sure that every round that we fired got a German. We were getting short of ammunition and must try and make every round count. After we'd fired a certain amount of rounds, we got to scramble back down the bank of the canal, run along a bit, then go up top again, just to try and bluff the Germans that there was a great company of us there. We were being hard pressed. We were being machine gunned, mortared, shelled. We were led to believe that the German tanks were made of cardboard and plywood, but by God, we knew the difference when they started firing at us. We got our heads down very, very quickly. The most terrible thing that I've ever experienced. They were even driving their lorries into the canal and trying to drive their tanks across the lorries, but the artillery managed to keep them at bay. It was very frightening. It really showed you what war was like.
Now, they're holding, but casualties are mounting. Every time the Germans attack, because they've got artillery, they've got mortars, and of course machine guns, rifles. The casualties are mounting. Where are the battalion headquarters? They're back at Drury's Farm. This will crop up quite a lot, which is just outside the village of Paradis, and it's on the right flank of the Norfolk's position, which is in the centre, as we said, of the 2nd Division line. The fighting continues. So that was on the 25th of May. The fighting continues on the 26th of May. And the remnants of the battalion are being reorganised by the acting CO, a chap called Major Ryder, and they're running short of officers and they're distributing them about the company. So it's all going on. The Germans start to get across the canal. They can't hold the whole line, and although the Norfolks launch counterattacks, the situation is blurring, isn't it? They don't know what's happening really.
Yeah, I mean that night there's an unreal calm.
So this is the night of the 26th,
it's the night of the 26th, 27th, and Major Ryder he seizes the opportunity to feed his men. And Sergeant Walter Gilding, he'd been posted from the Mortar Platoon to act as Company Quartermaster Sergeant of the HQ Company. And you're going to be CQMS Walter Gilding's HQ Company 2nd Royal Norfolks.
The meal was prepared. We were told where we had to go, which wasn't far anyway. I arrived at the battalion headquarters at the farm somewhere between 9 and 10 that evening. There was very little to be seen. Major Ryder came forward and spoke to us and said that he was glad to see us and that the food could be distributed when he could get the people off the perimeter where they were out on various defensive positions. From then on, we were feeding the lads as they were coming to us in dribs and drabs. We had the signallers actually in the farmhouse itself, and the riflemen were out in the buildings. I can remember them being called in from their various buildings, the cowshed, the pigsties, even out in the little meadows around the farm, wherever they had taken up a position. It went on like that all through the night till 3 o'clock in the morning. I was still there with the cook's wagon, still dishing out for the odd people that had been pulled in. Major Ryder came and said, "The situation seems to be getting worse. I think you'd better pack up and get back to B Echelon." It was then that I started to hear what sounded like heavy vehicles, possibly tanks, moving in the distance. Also, the first mortar bomb landed in the battalion area. He means the battalion headquarter area. It didn't seem to be very healthy to be there, so we packed up very quickly and we were clear by 3:30. That's 3:30 in the morning of the 27th. Coming out the farm gate down the road to the main road in the village, we were mortared down that road. There must have been 6 or 7 mortar bombs landed. I told the driver to put your foot down and get the hell out of this. Fortunately, the bombs missed us, but we had quite a bumpy ride. We raced back to the B Echelon area, where we found everybody was packing, ready to move. The quartermaster received a message saying that the battalion was going to be staying in their positions and were not to wait. We were not to wait. Wow. Now, the storm, as he says in that account, the storm starts to break about 3:30 in the morning, the 27th of May. And there's a terrific German bombardment, and then there's a dawn attack. And you're going to be Private Arthur Brough, who was caught in a sort of a Malay really, as the last surviving mortar team. And he's trying to support B Company, what's left of B Company, and I mean what's left of B Company. And they're in the village of Petit Cornet Malo. That may not be pronounced right, nothing ever is by me. So let's hear from you, Private Arthur Bruff.
We set our mortar up and it was getting a bit hectic round there. Lots of tanks and heavy gunfire. We were putting as much stuff down the mortar as we could to get rid of our ammunition. We were trying to repulse them, but we knew it wasn't a lot of good because there was so many. The mortar must have been red hot. There were only about 3 of us left by that time, and Platoon Sergeant Major Ireland, he got shot. We resorted to rifle fire, which was absolutely stupid, but I suppose it was instinct to try and do your job. Then we saw that it was absolutely hopeless. We chucked the bolts out of the rifle. Why you do these things, don't ask me why, but I think it must just be instinct. That's what you were taught to do. Immobilise your rifle, take the bolt out. Then we scattered. Tanks by the 100 were coming up. We just ran for it. What can you do when you see tanks coming at you? It was frightening, really. The mortar platoon seemed to have been isolated there. Johnny Cockerell, he was with me. We dived in a dyke. We got scattered dead in our tracks because there was a shell dropped quite near us from the tanks, and I could feel something in the back of my leg, and Johnny Cockerell, he got a piece out of his knee. Pretty bad. I looked after him as much as I could. Just a field dressing. Mine was just a superficial cut, 2 or 3 cuts on the back of my leg, and a lot of shrapnel splinters. We were in this dyke, and all of a sudden, the tanks were right on top of us, and the next thing we saw was a German officer standing there telling us, "The war is over, Tommy."
Yeah, that's I like that quote. And people who don't like oral history say there weren't hundreds of tanks. No, but that's what it felt like to him, and sometimes that's important, don't you feel? To get, I mean, that's he looked up and there's hundreds.
Yeah, that's his perspective, and that's what he felt.
Yeah.
And
I think that gets it across perfectly. The sheer shock and all of it. That's a great quote by Arthur. Now the situation's really bad by this time, and the remaining headquarters signallers. They're sent out to join the riflemen defending the immediate perimeter of Drury's farm. Because the German armour has got through. They've got through at the Petit Cornet Malo sector. They seem to have got through elsewhere. And who am I going to be?
You're going to be Private Robert Brown, once more of HQ Company, 2nd Norfolks.
Eventually, the CO, Major Ryder, ordered all surplus personnel out to the defence of battalion headquarters because we should have to make a defence on our own. So, I handed over the switchboard to the wireless operator who was on the brigade radio. I went out then, and the adjutant, Captain Long, told me to go forward to a row of trees towards the front. If I saw any Germans coming between the companies and us, I was to let him know. I was there for some time and no sign of anybody, so I withdrew about 100 yards or so to a farm building. Sensible lad. There was regimental police Lance Corporal in there, and between the 2 of us we kept watch until he happened to look back towards the German headquarters along the road, and there was a German motorcycle combination with a machine gun mounted on it coming from behind us. We fired and stopped the combination coming through.
Yeah, he looked back towards his own battalion headquarters, Pete, not the German one.
Yeah, sorry.
And that's where he saw the German motorcycle. So they were clearly behind them.
It's a really confused mishmash situation, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's obvious at that point that the Germans have broken through and that they're actually looking in the wrong direction. And Private Robert Brown goes on to say,
"We had to get back to battalion headquarters and let them know they were round behind us. The 2 of us dashed across the road as quickly as possible, crawled along the ditch to the farm and gave the information that we had. I then took up a position in the barn. We knocked holes through the galvanised walls, which were heavily riddled with shrapnel. The mortar bombs were dropping over the barn and behind us between the farm buildings. A friend of mine I was with, John Hagan, he said, 'We'll find somewhere a bit more safe.' We went to the end of the barn and there was a small brick outhouse. We went in and knocked bricks out for loopholes. That's where we continued our defence for the remainder of the day. The other side of the farm was all stables, cowsheds and barn stables. The men there had done the same, knocked bricks out and made loopholes, so we were more or less an all-round defence. We'd quite a lot of wounded. At first they were in a cellar under the house, and then it was hit so many times with shell fire and mortar bombs that it was on fire. We had to get the wounded out and lay them in a safer place, which was a very tricky position. Now, the next bit is a very dramatic series of quotes from Private Ernie Farrow that you're going to read. Now, as we said, he was in the chaps who are the pioneers. And he'd been used as emergency infantry, but now he's given his proper job. And you're going to read it. Private Ernie Farrow, Pioneer Section, HQ Platoon, 2nd Norfolk.
Corporal Mason shouted to me, "Strips, come on over here." I went across and he said, "Right, you and you, we've got to go and blow a bridge up. Go and find some amatol, gun cotton, whatever you can find and bring it across."
Classic volunteering now.
Yeah, absolutely.
You.
Major Ryder told Corporal Mason that his driver had been detailed to take us to this bridge. It was only a short distance away. The CO's vehicle was an old Humber car, and the driver's name was Hawker. He came from King's Lynn. He opened the back of the old car, and we put the gun cotton and primers in. The Sergeant Major came along and said, "Right, here lads, here's something to be going with," and he gave us a big tin of Bluebird toffees. The quartermaster came along and he said, "It's just a few rounds." 3 rounds of ammunition we were issued with. 3 rounds of ammunition to fight the German army. We thought, oh, God. With this, we all piled in this old car and we were away.
Now, this is all a tinge of... It's a bit farcical in some ways, isn't it? And I remember, like I'm sat here opposite you, sitting, listening to this story from Ernie Farrow. I remember where he lived. It was 30-odd years ago I interviewed it. But this is an amazing story. But somehow what stuck in his mind and what stuck in mine for years after is this bloody tin of Bluebird toffees. And I've always liked toffees, and they do feature again in the story. You're going to take up the story. There's a lot from Ernie here, and it's a lot of work for you.
We were so busy trying to get this tin lid off to get these toffees out. We were being shelled and machine gunned all the way. Not too badly, but the occasional shot or burst of machine gun fire. We knew that one bullet through the back of our car and we could all be blown to pieces.
Oh, with the explosives, yeah.
We hoped to God that the driver would get there as quick as he could. In no time at all, the driver turned round and said, "There you are, lads. There's the bridge coming up." We all looked up. The lid was still on the toffee. We still hadn't got that off. This happened in seconds, not minutes. We could see the bridge in front of us, and directly on our left-hand side was a big house. To our right was the canal. At the very instant that he spoke, a machine gun opened up, and the whole top of this old car was riddled by bullets, but not one of us was touched. We were still all alive, not even a scratch. We didn't wait for the second burst. We dived out because the Germans were firing from this house. There was no point in us trying to get to the bridge because they were already over it. We were straight into the canal. The driver, he was trying to turn his vehicle round to get back to headquarters to warn them that this bridge had already been taken. We heard this hell of an explosion and we were spattered by all the pieces of metal and whatnot as the poor old car was blown up and the driver with it. We tried to climb up to the edge of the canal bank and fire at the Germans. Somehow we managed to get a footing. How we did, I don't know, because the canal is all mud on the bank. It was a heck of a job, but we managed to get there and we fired our few rounds off at these Germans in the house and along the side of the bridge, hoping that every bullet would kill a German.
Now I'm just picturing him. I'm picturing the side of the canal and the mud and it's just click. And how many rounds did they have, Gary?
Well, 3 rounds apiece. So
that's not going to take long to fire 3 rounds.
It's not at all.
Anyway, you carry on the story, Ernie. Gary, Ernie, if you know what I mean.
There was no way we could get out of the canal where we were. So Corporal Mason told us, "Right, bolts out of your rifles, get rid of them." Our tin hats, everything went off into the canal. The Germans were on both sides, so it made no difference where we went, but we felt it safer to go on over to the other side because we couldn't get out of the canal. The banks were too high to climb, and if you started to climb the banks, you'd be picked off. Luckily for us, we were all good swimmers, and we swam underwater most of the way across, because as soon as you came up, you were fired at. We came up on the other side under this bed of rushes. We just kept still to stop even the ripples of the water for fear that the Germans would put machine guns into where we were. The corporal said, "Right, stop where you are, keep your heads down. I'm going to swim down the canal and find somewhere where we can climb out."
And I like, again, this is a corporal. We joke and laugh about corporals, but here is a corporal taking charge, doing his job, good NCO, looking after his men. He's the one who takes the initial risk. He goes forward. Anyway, Farrow, they're incredibly exposed. I mean, to joke about it, they're up to their necks in it, literally and figuratively.
And let's not forget they're unarmed.
Of course, no, they're absolutely helpless. Absolutely helpless. Anyway, you're going to keep on going with the story.
The three of us were very close together in these rushes. They were about 2 foot either side of me. I was in the centre. This young fellow on my left-hand side, almost touching me, his name was Porter, and he came from Beccles in Suffolk. He'd been in the army with me from the time we joined up. A very nice young fellow, and he said to me, "I'm just going to have a peek over the top." At that very instant I heard this machine gun, and I turned and looked up. This poor fellow had been shot right through the middle of his head, and the back of his head was missing. As quick as that, and he was sinking back in the water. I was trying to hold him up, which was no good, because he was already dead. This fellow on my right, his name was Reeve. Now, he was an old soldier, and he'd been out in India, and had 2 gold teeth put in the top of his plate. I was talking to him, telling him about poor old Porter, and I felt something hit my face. I put my hand up automatically, and I was covered in blood. I thought, God! I looked at the blood and thought I'd been hit. I felt again, but I was still all there. When I turned round to look, it was this poor fellow. What had happened was they'd shot his jaw, and his jaw had smacked me in the face. He was then disappearing underneath. He means underneath the water. The last thing I saw of him was these 2 gold teeth shining in the top of his head, and for many, many weeks afterwards, whenever I opened my eyes, I could see his face with no chin and his gold teeth showing. The water round me was red with the blood, but the poor boys, they'd gone. They were at the bottom.
Now, I remember him telling me that, and that's I mean, you said before we did this podcast, there's some horrible stuff in this. But if you're going to tell the story of an infantry battalion, you're going to get some terrible things. Anyway, the story goes on. Once again, you're Private Ernie Farrow.
A few minutes afterwards, the corporal came back. He came up at the side of me. He said, "Right, we can't fret about the poor boys. Let's go." We dived under and we swam. How far we swam, I've got no idea. We came up for a drop of air here and there. Eventually, he pulled on me and said, "Here we are," and there was this ditch right beside us. The first thing I wanted to do was get out of that damn canal, to get clear of it. He said, "You stop where you are, that's an order. Keep your head down. I'll go have a look to see if there's anything on this meadow."
Now, the story goes on, and I hope I cover it in my book. I'm not sure. I can't remember. But the corporal's wounded very shortly after, just in the arm, and Farrow's taken prisoner. We can't cover it all because, but what a story that is. Ernie Farrow, great bloke, and that people who lived in Norwich might remember him. Some people are interested in history because he was a really well-known veteran. Now, what's happening back at Drury's farm?
Well, the situation's becoming desperate as one by one the perimeter defence companies, they're overrun. Now, the Germans, they're clearly across the canal in considerable strength. So it was increasingly obvious that the headquarters company was cut off and that the situation was hopeless.
So it's not just the odd motorcycle now. They're completely surrounded, aren't they?
They are. And Private Robert Brown goes on to say,
"Towards the afternoon, Major Ryder came round to us and said there was no way we could get away from where we were. Ammunition was running very low, and he was taking opinions as to how we felt about fighting on or surrendering. Some said fight on, some said surrender. I said, Well, let's carry on as we are, because the morale was very high. There was no thought of being taken prisoner or getting killed or wounded. We were just carrying on fighting, carrying on the defence and making a joke of it all, really, laughing and joking between each other. We were causing more casualties than they were causing to us. But at that time, I should think that they must have outnumbered us by about 6-1. Eventually, he said, this is Ryder said, it's no good wasting human life. We couldn't hold them up indefinitely. We'd held them up for 3 days on the canal, which was a very good effort, and he decided that we should have to cease firing. But he said if anybody thought they could get away, then we were entitled to do our own thing. We wouldn't be running away from the battalion. We would be trying to get away and save ourselves. In other words, the men in the outbuilding and the stables went through the stable door to the field. Now, when they first, let's just pick. I noticed a couple of things then. One, the officers shouldn't have been asking the men. It's a bit like a tour guide asking the punters. And the moment you ask, you're going to get two different opinions coming. I remember Andy Tonga, we interviewed, I think, one of the first things he told me as a tour guide is don't ask the punters. Because they're the ones that you don't follow their thing, they'll be cross. It's much better just to tell people. The second thing is a theme that we explored in our book, Laugh or Cry, about the Great War and about soldiers' reactions to...
how humour helps them cope with a situation which, frankly, you couldn't cope with otherwise.
You either laugh or cry.
You laugh or cry.
And soldiers aren't meant to cry. So I found both of those things interesting. Now, so some of the men in the outbuildings of stables, they try and go through the stable door, and at first their surrender isn't accepted, is it? And who am I going to be?
You're going to be Private William O'Callaghan, once more HQ Company.
We hung a towel on the end of a rifle, and shortly afterwards all firing ceased. We opened the door and started to file out with our hands above our heads. The first dozen men out were mown down, and then the firing ceased. So that could be a confusion. That's the people. It isn't always obvious what's happening, but I just want to make it clear that could happen in normal fighting. It's bad, but it could happen in normal fighting. And I want to separate this part of the story from what's going to happen in future, because things are going to get very, very raw indeed shortly afterwards.
Yeah, so the white flag, the surrender's raised around about 1715, and the surrender is accepted.
So after this wrinkle in the process.
Yeah. So the dangerous part, that seems to be over. Now, the Norfolk, some of the First Royal Scots and a few other troops that have been captured nearby, they're marched away from Dunay Farm by number 3 Company of the 1st Battalion, 2nd SS Totenkopf Regiment, under the command of Hauptsturmführer Fritz Nörkling.
Now, I'm glad you had to say that. Now, that doesn't sound too good.
No, and remember that name.
Yeah, right. So I'm going to be Private William O'Callaghan again. I can't even say O'Callaghan. You managed that. Anyway, we marched down to a field about 300 yards away. Here we were searched. After we were searched, the wounded were attended to, and we were lined up in threes and marched across a field. After we had been searched, some high-ranking German officer, I think he had red lapels on his greatcoat, came up and spoke to the other German officers there. I cannot remember how many there were, and waved his hand, whereupon we moved off. We halted on the road about 200 yards from where we had been searched to let some vehicles pass. We started off again to march along the roads, and met German troops who behaved in a very brutal manner towards us, hitting us with their rifles and pushing us about. On the march we halted once or twice, and it is possible that one of those halts occurred just before we turned off into a gateway leading into a farm. Now, this is now where this goes from being unfortunate and then bad behaviour, and then it spins off into murderous behaviour. And they are approaching something called Creton Farm. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. It's spelled Creton. And you're now going to be Signaller Albert Pooley of A Company, 2nd Norfolks.
There are 100 of us prisoners marching in column of threes. We turned off the dusty French road through a gateway and into a meadow beside the buildings of a farm. I saw, with one of the nastiest feelings I've ever had in my life, 2 heavy machine guns inside the meadow. They were manned and pointing at the head of our column. I felt as though an icy hand gripped my stomach. The guns began to spit fire, and even as the front men began to fall, I said fiercely, "This can't be! They can't do this to us!" For a few seconds, the cries and shrieks of our stricken men drowned the cracking of the guns. Men fell like grass before a scythe. The invisible blade came nearer and then swept through me. I felt a terrific searing pain in my left leg and wrist and pitched forward in a red world of tearing agony. My scream of pain mingled with the cries of my mates, but even as I fell forward into a heap of dying men, the thought stabbed my brain. If I ever get out of here, the swine who did this will pay for it.
Now, this is an outright massacre carried out by those SS troops. In those few moments, 97 men, not all Royal Norfolks, but most of them Royal Norfolks, were cut down. And then the SS bastards who are doing this, and I don't apologise for using that word, they move amongst the 97 men. And what are they doing, Gary?
Well, they're administering the coup de grace. They're either administering it by bullet or bayonet to all those who look like they might still be breathing. Now think about this. In this horrific situation, Pooley, he's received another 2 bullets in his left leg. But by a supreme act of will, which frankly, I don't think I'd be capable of, he kept still, and thus he survives until the SS butchers leave the scene.
Right word there again. Bastards or butchers.
Now, only one other man had survived the massacre. That's Signaller William O'Callaghan, who'd been lucky enough to escape with just an arm wound beneath the shattered corpses of his friends.
This is another point. These are their friends.
Yeah.
He
refers to them as his mates in that quote.
And William says this. Suddenly, fire. This is going back to the. Sorry, this is his version of what Pooley's just said. Suddenly, firing started. The men started falling from the front of the column. When I saw the men falling, I threw myself forward and fell into a slight depression in the ground. And in falling, stretched my arms out before me and sustained a slight flesh wound in the left arm. After the firing stopped, I heard my comrades shouting and shrieking in their agony. I then heard what sounded to me like the fixing of bayonets, and shortly afterwards I heard moans and shrieks from more of my comrades, which sounded to me as if they were being bayoneted. I did not see this, since I did not lift my head, as I was afraid of being bayoneted myself. There was also pistol and rifle shots, which lasted for several minutes. The Germans left before long, after having made sure that there was no sign of life. After a while, 2 Germans came and stood behind me, and I heard them talking, but they left again without having done anything. Can you imagine what it must have been like in that pile of wounded and well, most of them dead, but wounded, and then you can hear the bayoneters coming round and bayoneting, and you just playing dead. And anyway,
no, do you know what, Pete? I can't imagine.
No,
that is horrific. Now it gets worse because O'Callaghan, he actually helps drag the crippled Pooley from that awful pile of bodies. Now, although he saves him, yeah. Now, although both are recaptured a few days later,
now they're recaptured by what I would call normal German troops, not these utter swines.
They survived the war. And they do get to wreak their vengeance on McLachlan when they had the satisfaction of acting as prosecution witnesses at a British military court in Hamburg in October 1948. Now, as a result, McLachlan was found guilty and hanged on the 29th of January 1949. So Pooley, he got to keep his promise.
And it couldn't happen to a nicer chap. This is a terrible, terrible massacre. There were a couple of others. We went to Umhurt, where was a similar thing happened, but this is, I think, one of the worst. But it's just awful. Now, but some people escape. Now, we're going back in time a bit to Private Rob. I'm going to be Private Robert Brown again, HQ Company, and these are the life or death decisions you make. Do you go through that? You're surrendering or trying to escape. Now, he's going to try and escape, and so he doesn't go through the door of the barn to meet with the others. So he says this. Myself, John Hagan, and another pal of mine, Bill Liffin, decided we would go out of the door onto the road, which was in the opposite direction to the others. The smoke from the burning house was going that way, so we thought we'd keep in the smoke as extra cover in the hopes of getting away. We went in a ditch at the side of the road, and in the ditch was the adjutant lying on the ground, wounded, and a medical officer was there. We attempted to go out of the ditch and cross the road, but as we did so, the German patrols were coming up from the village of Paradis, and we just couldn't get over the road. They just shouted, "Hands up!" or words to that effect. And that was that. They pushed and knocked us about a bit, but nothing outrageous. So just a few yards. Yeah. And this, I mean, most Germans will take you prisoner. These SS bastards, they're pretty special. Because I want to make it clear that normally if you were taken prisoner by the Germans, you were taken prisoner. You weren't. This is a serious thing.
Now, what this means is that the fighting strength of the battalion has almost all been either killed, wounded, captured, or massacred.
I think it's good to put that separate because that is special, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, only the drivers and cooks of the B echelon escapes, and you're going to be CQMS Walter Gilding.
Yeah, just to finish the story. And Gilding says this: the refugee problem was really terrible then, and it was difficult to get transport along the roads. It was absolute chaos. If Stukas came down, we would dive off the lorries and get into the hedgerows or ditches, and the refugees would do the same. They wouldn't be so quick on the mark as us, so we would pile back into the lorry and drive through before the refugees assembled onto the roadways again. So they'd be first into the ditch and first out of the ditch and get a bit of a go. But you wouldn't go far before they'd all be on the road again with their handcarts, baggage, horse and carts. Everything was there. We were on the road with a truck for 2 days, and things got so bad that we just had to abandon the vehicle. And I've interviewed lots of people from Gort's army time, and this is standard. As you get nearer Dunkirk, you just have to leave your vehicles. And in fact, they had huge lorry parks as well. Sometimes it's organised, sometimes they just dump them by the side of the road.
So now they're on foot and they're making their way to Dunkirk because they'd heard that the evacuation was taking place from there. And Walter Gilding goes on.
We arrived at one end of the beach where all the sand dunes were. We dug in. We stayed there that night, which would be the 30th, 31st. We had a bird's eye view of from where we were, watching all the lads lining up down to the water's edge, ready to be evacuated, with gaps of 20 to 30 yards between each group. There must have been 10 of these queues. Out in the water, way out on the horizon, were naval destroyers and also civilian boats, private yachts and all types of boats. Plying in between the beach and them were small boats, some just rowing boats. I thought, God, they're going to take a long while to get this lot off. I thought, well, there's no way we're going to hold up the whole German army. It's just a matter of time. We shall either be overrun, captured, or hopefully we're going to be evacuated. And actually, nice to say that those survivors from the Norfolks were evacuated on the early hours of the morning of 1st of June. I remember interviewing Gilding as well. He was another great character. So tell me, what's happened? We started these recordings talking about the lads being recruited. Those lovely. Remember how funny it was talking about the training. How nice that was, wasn't it? All lads together.
But it was always going to be different with an infantry battalion and regiment because it's more. They get the blood and guts of war.
It's up close and personal.
So how many of the original battalion are left?
This is special. The massacre of the Norfolk.
How many are left?
Only the estimates, and they're never right, are they? They reckon only about 139 of the original battalion returned from Dunkirk. Lots of them prisoner of war, of course, taken, but
far too many of them were dead.
So what a story this is. So is that the end of the Norfolk story? Have we finished this series of recordings, or are they reborn back in England?
No, we've not finished, so that tells you something,
Peter, doesn't it? Because the second Norfolks will rise from these rather grim ashes.
Well, just think about the date. This is not the end of the war. We've got to carry on. And
they do. Well, thanks for joining me. And you can't say it's been a pleasure, this one, can we?
No, but it was very moving, Pete. And I think, it's important that you understand and get, oral history providing you something that you can't get from any other sort of history. That's eyewitness reports as they saw it, as they felt, their emotions. You made the point about, hundreds of Germans of tanks, but that's what he felt. And I think you don't get You don't get stories like
You don't get bluebird toffees in written accounts.
that. No, I don't know if they ever got the lid off.
No, but I'll tell you something. I'll never forget those 2 gold teeth and the jawbone. And perhaps let's leave it at that.
Cheers, Pete.
Cheers.